In the harsh fluorescent light of a prison corridor, two men's eyes met, a moment of connection that would ultimately lead to passion, betrayal, and blood. The line between captor and captive blurred, obliterated by desire. But in the shadows of Pinewood Correctional Facility, some secrets carry a death sentence. By the time the sun rose on that frigid January morning in 2023, 3 lives would be shattered beyond repair, and the small city of Riverdale would never look at its prison the same way again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, Riverdale prided itself on being the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, where front doors remained unlocked at night, and where the biggest source of excitement was the annual summer festival. With a population of just under 20,000, it was large enough to provide the necessities of modern life, but small enough to maintain that cherished sense of community. At the edge of town, however, stood Pinewood Correctional Facility, a stark reminder of the darker side of humanity that most residents preferred to ignore. For the men and women who worked at Pinewood, the prison wasn't just a building. It was a world unto itself, with its own rules, hierarchy, and culture. Among those who donned the grey uniform every day was Correctional Officer Mike Reynolds, a man whose life would become the center of a storm that no one saw coming. Mike Reynolds hadn't dreamed of becoming a prison guard. Growing up in the blue-collar neighborhoods of Riverdale, he had harbored ambitions of becoming a police detective, inspired by the crime shows he devoured as a teenager. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After his father's sudden death during his senior year of high school, Mike had to abandon his college plans to help support his mother and younger sister. The steady paycheck and benefits offered by Pinewood Correctional Facility were too good to pass up, especially for a young man with only a high school diploma. By the time Mike turned 42, he had spent nearly half his life patrolling the corridors of Pinewood. The once temporary job had become a career, and Mike had risen to become one of the most respected officers at the facility. Known for his fair treatment of inmates and his ability to diffuse tense situations without resorting to force, Mike was often assigned to the more challenging wings of the prison. His colleagues admired his calm demeanor and unwavering professionalism, never suspecting the turmoil that lay beneath the surface. Behind the confident exterior, Mike harbored a secret that he had kept hidden for decades. He was gay. In the conservative community of Riverdale, and especially within the hypermasculine environment of the prison system, Mike had learned early on to conceal his true self. He dated women occasionally to keep up appearances, but these relationships inevitably fizzled out. To his family and co-workers, he was simply married to the job or hadn't found the right woman yet. Only his sister Sarah knew the truth, a confidence shared during a vulnerable moment after their mother's funeral 5 years earlier. The weight of this secret had grown heavier with each passing year, leaving Mike isolated and increasingly lonely. His life had fallen into a monotonous routine: work, home, sleep, repeat. The only bright spots were his Sunday dinners with Sarah and her family, and the occasional fishing trip with his childhood friend Bobby, who had remained loyal despite their diverging life paths. Everything changed with the arrival of Inmate, 47291 Jason Mendez. At 35, Jason was serving a 7-year sentence for fraud and identity theft. Unlike many of the hardened criminals at Pinewood, Jason was educated, articulate, and possessed a charm that set him apart. With his athletic build, piercing blue eyes, and disarming smile, he caught Mike's attention immediately. But it was Jason's intelligence and wit that truly drew Mike in during their brief interactions, during meal distribution and recreational periods. What began as professional courtesy soon evolved into something more. Jason would engage Mike in conversations about books, music, or current events, subjects rarely discussed within Pinewood's walls. These moments, though brief, became the highlights of Mike's increasingly dreary days. For the first time in years, he felt seen, understood, even appreciated, not just as an authority figure, but as a person with thoughts and feelings of his own. Sergeant Frank Cooper, Mike's direct supervisor, was the first to notice the subtle shift in Mike's behavior. A 25-year veteran of the correctional system, Cooper had developed an almost sixth sense for detecting irregularities in his officers' conduct. He observed how Mike's patrol routes increasingly took him past Jason's cell, how their conversations seemed to linger just a bit too long, how Mike's expression softened ever so slightly when Jason was nearby. "Reynolds, a word," Cooper said, one afternoon, pulling Mike into an empty office. "You've been spending a lot of time with Mendez lately." Mike felt his heart rate spike, but maintained his composure. "Just keeping an eye on him, Sarge. He's got influence with some of the younger inmates. Better to keep those channels open." Cooper studied Mike's face, his years of experience telling him there was more to the story. "Just remember where the line is, Reynolds. 15 years I've worked with you, and I've never had to worry. Don't make me start now." The warning, though gentle, sent a wave of panic through Mike. Had he been that transparent? Would Cooper report his suspicions to Director Wilson? The fear of discovery should have been enough to make Mike pull back, to re-establish the professional distance between himself and Jason. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The potential consequences only heightened the forbidden allure of their connection. As winter settled over Riverdale, bringing shorter days and longer nights, the relationship between Mike and Jason crossed the invisible boundary from friendship to something far more dangerous. It began with lingering glances, then progressed to accidental touches during routine interactions. Finally, during a late-night shift, when Mike was assigned to a quieter section of the prison, Jason whispered an invitation that changed everything. Their first intimate encounter occurred in a rarely used storage closet, a hasty, passionate meeting that left both men shaken by its intensity. For Mike, it was both terrifying and exhilarating, the first authentic connection he had felt in years, yet one that could destroy his career and reputation in an instant. For Jason, whose motivations remained more opaque, it represented power, control, and perhaps something genuinely emotional that had been missing in his life before incarceration. What followed was a dangerous dance of secret meetings, coded messages, and elaborate precautions. Mike adjusted surveillance schedules, volunteered for specific shifts, and created opportunities for brief, private moments together. Each encounter was a rush of adrenaline and desire, followed by crushing waves of guilt and fear of discovery. Yet neither man seemed capable of ending what they had started. In the bright light of the prison's medical wing, Dr. Elaine Chen frowned at the test results on her computer screen. The routine blood work from inmate 47291, Jason Mendez, showed something concerning. As the prison's chief medical officer, Dr. Chen had seen her share of health issues among the incarcerated population, but this particular diagnosis always gave her pause. Jason Mendez was HIV positive. Protocol required immediate notification of the inmate and implementation of treatment plans. It also necessitated a review of potential exposure risks within the facility. Dr. Chen had no way of knowing about Mike and Jason's relationship, but she did note in her report that Mendez had not disclosed his condition during his intake screening 18 months earlier, suggesting he had either contracted the virus at Pinewood or had deliberately concealed his status upon arrival. When Jason received his diagnosis, his reaction was not what Dr. Chen expected. Rather than shock or denial, she observed a strange calmness, almost as if the news confirmed something he already suspected. What she couldn't see was the calculation happening behind his eyes as he contemplated how this information might be leveraged. That evening, when Mike made his rounds, Jason passed him a note requesting a private conversation about an urgent medical matter. Despite the risk, Mike arranged to meet Jason in the same storage closet that had become their clandestine rendezvous point. The news Jason shared hit Mike like a physical blow. "I'm positive," Jason said, his voice eerily steady, "and if we've been together all these times, you probably are too." Mike staggered back, his mind racing through their encounters over the past 3 months. They had been careful, but not always, not every time. The probability that he had been infected sent a cold wave of terror through his body. "Did you know?" Mike managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before us, did you know?" Jason's hesitation before answering told Mike everything. "I suspected. I had symptoms before I came to Pinewood, but I never got tested. I didn't want to know." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. The man who had made Mike feel alive again, who had drawn him out of his shell and into a relationship that, while forbidden, had given his life new meaning, had knowingly put him at risk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The revelation shattered whatever illusions Mike had constructed about their relationship, about Jason's character, about his own judgment. In the days that followed, Mike existed in a fog of fear and anger. He called in sick, something he rarely did, to get tested at a clinic 2 towns over, far from the prying eyes of Riverdale. The days waiting for results were the longest of his life, each hour stretching into an eternity of worst-case scenarios and crushing anxiety. When the test came back positive, something inside Mike broke. The careful compartmentalization he had maintained his entire adult life, separating his professional persona from his private desires, collapsed entirely. His HIV status wasn't just a personal health crisis. It was evidence of his relationship with an inmate, a relationship that violated every professional standard and could potentially lead to criminal charges. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all now hung in the balance because of his involvement with Jason Mendez. At work, the changes in Mike didn't go unnoticed. Officer Linda Parker, who had worked alongside Mike for nearly a decade and considered him a friend, observed his deterioration with growing concern. The once unflappable officer now jumped at small noises, snapped at minor infractions, and had developed dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "Mike, whatever's going on, you can talk to me," Linda offered during a quiet moment in the staff break room. "We've all got stuff, you know? No judgment here." Mike regarded her with haunted eyes, but couldn't bring himself to share the truth. Instead, he mumbled something about family problems and quickly changed the subject. Linda wasn't convinced, but she respected his privacy too much to push further. Later, she would regret not being more insistent. As Mike spiraled, Jason's behavior took an unexpected turn. Rather than showing remorse for potentially infecting Mike, he became more demanding, leveraging Mike's fear of exposure to secure special privileges and contraband. The emotional manipulation was calculated and cruel, revealing a side of Jason that had been carefully hidden beneath the charming exterior. "You know what happens to screws who fuck inmates, right?" Jason whispered during one of their increasingly tense meetings. "I could ruin you with one conversation with the director, but I won't, as long as we understand each other." The relationship that had once been Mike's escape from loneliness had transformed into a trap, with Jason holding all the power. Each shift at Pinewood became psychological torture for Mike, forced to face the man who had betrayed him while continuing to meet his demands to prevent exposure. The strain began to show in every aspect of his life, from his deteriorating physical health to his increasingly erratic behavior. Sarah Reynolds noticed the change in her brother immediately. The close bond they shared meant she could read the signs that others might miss: the weight loss, the nervous habits, the way he would check his phone constantly as if expecting bad news. When she invited him for their usual Sunday dinner, Mike arrived late, distracted, and barely touched the meal she had prepared. "What's happening to you, Mike?" Sarah asked directly, her concern overriding politeness. "And don't tell me it's nothing. I know you better than that." In that moment, faced with his sister's genuine worry, Mike came closer than ever to unburdening himself. But the shame was too overwhelming. How could he explain that he had not only violated his professional oath, but had potentially contracted a life-altering virus in the process? How could he admit to such catastrophic lapses in judgment? Instead, he deflected, blaming work stress and promising to take better care of himself. That night, alone in his modest apartment in the Westview neighborhood, Mike stared at his service weapon, turning it over in his hands as dark thoughts crowded his mind. The pistol represented the last vestiges of control in a life that was rapidly unraveling. He placed it back in its lockbox without using it, but the fact that he had considered the possibility frightened him more than he cared to admit. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday morning in January 2023. Mike arrived at Pinewood for the early shift, his mind clouded by lack of sleep and the side effects of the HIV medication he had started taking secretly. As he made his way through the security checkpoints, a message was relayed from Director Wilson's office. He was wanted for an immediate meeting. Mike's heart pounded as he made his way to the administrative wing. Had Jason finally followed through on his threats? Had someone discovered their relationship? The short walk to the director's office felt like a death march, each step bringing him closer to the end of life as he knew it. Director Thomas Wilson was not alone when Mike entered the office. Sergeant Cooper stood beside the director's desk, his expression unreadable. On the desk lay an envelope and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. "Officer Reynolds," Director Wilson began, his tone formal and cold. "We've received some concerning information regarding your conduct with inmate Mendez." The world seemed to tilt beneath Mike's feet. This was it, the moment he had been dreading for months. His career, his freedom, everything he had worked for was about to be swept away. As Director Wilson continued to speak, outlining the evidence of inappropriate contact and potential policy violations, Mike felt a strange calm descend upon him. The constant fear and anxiety that had plagued him for months suddenly crystallized into a clear, terrible resolve. "I understand, sir," Mike said when Wilson had finished. "May I have a moment to compose myself before we proceed further?" The director, perhaps mistaking Mike's unusual composure for acceptance, nodded. "Take 5 minutes, Reynolds. But this isn't going away. There will be an investigation and, depending on the findings, potentially criminal charges." Mike left the office, not with the intention of gathering his thoughts, but with a plan forming in his mind. A plan born of desperation, betrayal, and a profound sense that there was no way back from the abyss he had fallen into. He made his way not to the break room or the restroom, but directly to the wing where Jason Mendez was housed. Using his security clearance one last time, Mike entered the cell block during recreation period. Jason was in the common area, playing cards with 2 other inmates. When he saw Mike approaching with an intensity he had never witnessed before, Jason's confident smirk faltered. "We need to talk," Mike said, his voice low and steady. "Now." What happened next would be pieced together from surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence. Mike led Jason to a corridor junction with a known blind spot in the camera coverage. Words were exchanged, heated, desperate words that no recording captured. Then, in a moment of unbridled rage and betrayal, Mike drew his service weapon and fired twice. The first bullet struck Jason in the chest, the second in the head. The man who had brought such passion and subsequent destruction into Mike's life crumpled to the floor, dead before he hit the ground. The sound of gunshots triggered an immediate lockdown. But before security protocols could be fully implemented, Mike had already moved to his next target. Sergeant Frank Cooper was responding to the shots fired alert when he encountered Mike. In the corridor near the administrative offices, whatever Cooper saw in Mike's eyes in that moment must have told him everything he needed to know. He reached for his own weapon, but Mike was faster, firing 3 times. Cooper fell, mortally wounded, as alarms blared and officers scrambled to respond to the unprecedented crisis unfolding within Pinewood's walls. With the facility in chaos, Mike made his way to the eastern perimeter fence. He might have escaped. In the confusion, had it not been for Officer Linda Parker, who spotted him from her position in Watchtower 3. Linda, who had worried about Mike for weeks, now found herself faced with an impossible choice as she watched her friend and colleague raise his weapon toward the approaching response team. "Mike, don't!" she shouted through the tower's speaker system. "Please, it doesn't have to end like this." For a brief moment, Mike hesitated, looking up at the tower where Linda's voice had come from. Perhaps in that instant, he considered surrender, considered that there might still be a way forward, however difficult. But as the tactical response team closed in, weapons drawn, the moment passed. Mike raised his gun one final time, not toward the officers, but to his own temple. A single shot echoed across the prison yard, and Officer Mike Reynolds, a man who had spent his life in uniform, upholding the law while hiding his true self, fell to the ground. By the time medical personnel reached him, he was beyond saving. In the aftermath, as investigators swarmed Pinewood and news vans gathered outside its gates, the small city of Riverdale found itself thrust into the national spotlight. The double murder-suicide within the prison walls was shocking enough, but as details emerged about the relationship between Officer Reynolds and inmate Mendez, and the HIV diagnosis that had apparently triggered the deadly chain of events, the story took on sensationalistic proportions in media coverage. For those who had known Mike Reynolds, his sister Sarah, his friend Bobby, his colleagues at Pinewood, the tragedy was incomprehensible. The man they thought they knew, the dedicated officer, the quiet, dependable brother and friend, had harbored depths of desperation none of them had recognized until it was too late. In the days following the shooting, as Riverdale grappled with the shock and the families of the victims struggled to make sense of their losses, a more complete picture of the events leading to that fateful day began to emerge. Detective Marcus Johnson, assigned to lead the investigation, uncovered evidence of the months-long relationship between Mike and Jason. Notes passed between them, adjusted patrol schedules, witness accounts of unusual interactions. Most damning was Jason's journal, discovered hidden in his cell, which detailed not only the relationship, but suggested that he had deliberately targeted Mike from the beginning. Entries indicated that Jason had known about his HIV status before entering Pinewood and had selected Mike as a potential mark based on subtle cues that suggested his hidden sexuality and apparent loneliness. "Found my ticket today," one entry read, dated just weeks after Jason's arrival at the facility. "Guard with the sad eyes. Watches me when he thinks I don't notice. This might be easier than I thought." The journal painted a picture of calculated manipulation rather than genuine affection, suggesting that Jason had planned to use his relationship with Mike to secure privileges, contraband, and eventually leverage for an early release. The HIV transmission appeared to be not just a reckless disregard for Mike's health, but potentially a deliberate act designed to increase Jason's control over the vulnerable officer. As Detective Johnson shared these findings with Sarah Reynolds, she struggled to reconcile this new information with the brother she had known her entire life. "Why didn't he come to me?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "I knew he was gay. I would have understood, would have helped him." "People who feel trapped don't always see the doors that are open to them," Johnson replied gently. "Your brother was carrying more than anyone realized." The memorial service for Officer Mike Reynolds was held at the Riverdale Community Church on a bitterly cold morning, snowflakes drifting down like whispered regrets. The attendant spoke volumes about the complicated legacy he left behind, the front pews filled with uniformed officers, their badges wrapped in black bands of mourning, while many seats remained conspicuously empty. Director Wilson delivered a brief, formal eulogy that touched on Mike's years of service, but carefully avoided any mention of the circumstances surrounding his death. Sarah Reynolds sat alone in the front row, her husband and children beside. Her face a mask of grief and incomprehension. In the weeks that followed, Riverdale attempted to return to normalcy, but the shadow of what had happened at Pinewood lingered. Local newspapers gradually stopped running stories about the incident. National media crews packed up their equipment and moved on to the next tragedy, and the formal investigation approached its conclusion. Yet beneath this veneer of healing, profound changes were taking place. Dr. Elaine Chen, haunted by questions of whether she could have somehow prevented the tragedy, initiated a complete overhaul of Pinewood's health screening protocols. Her recommendations, initially met with resistance due to budget constraints, gained traction after several inmates came forward with their own stories of intimidation and exploitation within the prison's walls. The scrutiny brought by Mike and Jason's story had opened a floodgate, exposing systemic issues that had festered for years. Linda Parker, who had watched helplessly as her colleague took his own life, found herself unable to return to Pinewood. The recurring nightmares and crushing guilt that she should have recognized Mike's distress sooner, should have done more to help him, drove her to resign from her position. With the support of her therapist, she eventually channeled her grief into advocacy, founding a support group for correctional officers dealing with trauma and mental health issues. The irony that Mike might have benefited from such a resource was not lost on her. For Sarah Reynolds, the path forward was even more challenging. Beyond the shock of losing her brother to suicide, she had to contend with the revelations about his sexuality, his relationship with an inmate, and his final violent acts. The brother she thought she knew had harbored depths she had never glimpsed, despite being his closest confidant. The Mike, who had coached her son's Little League team and who had helped her through her divorce, seemed irreconcilable with the man who had taken 2 lives before ending his own. "I keep thinking there must have been signs," Sarah confided to Detective Johnson during one of their follow-up conversations. "Something I missed, something I could have said or done differently." Johnson, who had seen too many families tear themselves apart with such questions, shook his head gently. "From everything we've learned, your brother was exceptionally good at compartmentalizing. He kept these parts of himself so separate that nobody saw the whole picture. Not you, not his colleagues, maybe not even himself until it was too late. The investigation ultimately confirmed what many had already pieced together. Jason Mendez had deliberately targeted Mike, exploiting his loneliness and hidden sexuality to establish a relationship that quickly evolved from manipulation to genuine control. The HIV transmission appeared intentional, with evidence suggesting Jason had known his status before incarceration and had used it as a weapon against others in the past. Sergeant Cooper and Director Wilson had discovered the relationship through another inmate seeking preferential treatment in exchange for information, leading to the confrontation that triggered Mike's deadly rampage. What the official report couldn't capture was the human cost beyond the immediate victims. The ripple effects extended to the families left behind, Jason's elderly mother in Arizona who refused to claim his body, Cooper's wife and teenage sons who moved away from Riverdale, unable to bear the whispers and sidelong glances, and Sarah Reynolds, who found herself simultaneously grieving her brother while grappling with anger at his actions. 6 months after the shooting, as Summer returned to Riverdale, a package arrived at Sarah's door. It contained personal effects from Mike's apartment that had been held as evidence during the investigation, photo albums, military medals that had belonged to their father, and a sealed envelope with Sarah's name written in Mike's neat handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it to find a letter dated 2 days before the shooting. "Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, I've either found the courage to tell you everything or something has happened that made this revelation inevitable. I hope it's the former, but I fear it might be the latter." The pages that followed contained a confession, not just about Jason and their relationship, but about the lifetime of hiding, of shame, of feeling trapped in an identity that wasn't fully his own. Mike described the profound isolation of his double life, the brief joy he had found in Jason's attention, and the devastating betrayal of the HIV diagnosis. The letter didn't excuse his actions or hint at what he would ultimately do, but it offered Sarah something she had been desperately seeking: context for the brother she thought she knew. "I don't expect you to understand," the letter concluded. "I barely understand myself anymore, but please know that you were the best part of my life, the one person who saw me, even if you didn't see all of me. Whatever happens, remember that." As Sarah folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, she felt a complex wave of emotions: grief, anger, compassion, and regret, all mingled together. The letter couldn't bring Mike back or undo the damage he had caused, but it offered a window into the turmoil that had driven him to such desperate acts. In his words, she found not absolution, but a kind of terrible clarity. On what would have been Mike's 43rd birthday, Sarah visited his grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, birds singing in the oak trees that provided dappled shade over the rows of headstones. Mike's marker was simple, bearing only his name and dates, with no mention of his service or the circumstances of his death. Sarah placed a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that had grown in their backyard as children, beside the stone. "I got your letter," she said softly, feeling slightly foolish for speaking aloud, but needing to say the words nonetheless. "I wish you had trusted me enough to tell me while you were still here. We could have figured something out, Mike. There were other options." The tears she had been holding back spilled down her cheeks. "I'm still angry with you. For what you did, for not letting me help, for leaving us to make sense of all this. But I'm trying to understand. I'm trying." As Sarah walked back to her car, she noticed a familiar figure waiting by the cemetery gate, Officer Linda Parker. The two women had met briefly during the investigation but hadn't spoken since. Linda looked uncertain, clutching a small potted plant in her hands. "I hope you don't mind," Linda said hesitantly. "I've been meaning to come for weeks, but couldn't bring myself to do it alone." Sarah studied the woman who had witnessed her brother's final moments. In another lifetime, under different circumstances, they might have been friends, two people who cared deeply about Mike Reynolds, each knowing a different side of him. "I don't mind," Sarah replied after a moment. "I think he would have liked to know someone else remembered." Together they walked back to Mike's grave, two women connected by tragedy, but also by a shared desire to make sense of it. As Linda placed her small tribute beside Sarah's wildflowers, they began to talk about Mike, about grief, about the complicated process of reconciling the person you thought you knew with hidden truths revealed too late. In the cool shade of the cemetery, a tentative friendship took root, built on the understanding that healing doesn't mean forgetting or excusing, but rather finding a way to hold the whole truth, however painful, and continue moving forward. For Sarah, it was the first step in a long journey toward acceptance, not just of who her brother had been, but of the complex reality that people we love can carry darkness we never suspected, can make choices we cannot comprehend, and can still deserve to be mourned. 1 year after the Pinewood tragedy, significant changes had transformed both the facility and the broader correctional system in the state. Dr. Chen's advocacy had resulted in mandatory comprehensive health screenings for all inmates and staff, coupled with education programs about communicable diseases. Anonymous reporting systems had been implemented to allow inmates and officers to safely report misconduct or concerns. A memorial bench had been placed in Franklin Park, dedicated not specifically to the victims of the shooting, but more broadly to those lost to silence and stigma, a careful phrasing that acknowledged the complex nature of the tragedy without glorifying or simplifying it. Sarah Reynolds, who had initially wanted nothing more than to escape the whispers and judgment of Riverdale, found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for mental health awareness among law enforcement officers. The support group she started, with Linda Parker, had grown to include officers from neighboring counties, providing a safe space to discuss the unique pressures and challenges of their profession. While nothing could bring Mike back or erase the pain his actions had caused, Sarah found purpose in working to prevent others from reaching the same breaking point of desperation and isolation. Detective Johnson, who had maintained contact with Sarah throughout the investigation and aftermath, stopped by one of these support group meetings on its first anniversary. As he listened to officers share their experiences with depression, anxiety, and the culture of silence that often prevented them from seeking help, he reflected on how a tragedy that had begun with secrets and shame had ultimately sparked conversations that might save lives. On his way out, Johnson paused to speak with Sarah. "Your brother's story didn't end the way anyone would have wanted," he said quietly. "But what you're doing here, it matters. It might not feel like enough, but it's something." Sarah nodded, her eyes showing the weariness of someone who had walked through fire, but also the quiet determination of a person who had found meaning in the ashes. "It's not enough," she agreed, "but it's a start." As Detective Johnson drove away from the community center where the support group met, he passed Pinewood Correctional Facility on the outskirts of town. The imposing structure looked much the same from the outside, but he knew that within its walls, small but significant changes were taking place. Changes that might have made a difference for Mike Reynolds and Jason Mendez had they come sooner. In Riverdale, life continued. New stories and scandals eventually overshadowed the Pinewood tragedy. Children who were too young to understand what had happened would grow up knowing only fragments of the story, passed down with varying degrees of accuracy. But for those closest to the events of that January morning, the impact remained indelible, a reminder of how quickly a life can unravel when shame, secrets, and desperation collide, and of how the aftermath of such destruction requires not just time but active work to heal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.